everyone, let's talk about operant conditioning. First, what is operant conditioning? We can think about operant conditioning occurring when consequences start to become associated with actions. I like to call this active learning because in this case, the participant performs a behavior and then receives a consequence. Now, when you hear the word consequence, you might think of that as being a bad thing, like a punishment. And that's not what it means. It just means an outcome. You do some behavior and something happens as a result of that behavior. Now, the consequences only happen after that behavior is performed. So the participant actually has to be active in order to get that consequence. So this type of learning requires the participant to actually be engaged actively in order for it to take place. So operant conditioning really stems from the law of effect. This is a theory that just basically states that behavior is more likely to occur if good things happen after you do it. So if you receive a pleasing consequence, so if you get something good, you're more likely to engage in that behavior again. But on the flip side of it, if something bad happens as a result of your behavior, then you're less likely to do it in the future. So good behavior followed by, a good consequence or a good outcome is more likely to happen again. But a behavior that's followed by a negative consequence, something bad, then that's, less likely to happen again in the future. That's what the law states. Now, if we look at the different types of consequences or outcomes that can happen, there can be positive consequences. So positive consequences are really meant to be what we call reinforcing. We give these when we want the behavior to happen again in the future. So our participant or our subject does something good. We want them to do it again. So we give them something that they want, or we take away something that they don't like. Okay, we'll get to that. But we want to reinforce that behavior. It was good. We want them to do it again. So we want to give them a positive consequence or something good, right? So this reinforcement, though, can actually be either positive or negative. I know that seems a little bit odd to say that something that is reinforcement can actually be negative. But here in this case, positive and negative just means that something is either added or something bad is taken away. So let's take a look at a few examples. So positive is when we add something. So if we want to reinforce a behavior and we want to add something, we want it to be positive, we're going to give the subject something that they would like, right? So for example, for you, something that would be good would be money, right? If you get money, whatever you did to get that money, you're more likely to do. So if you're doing a good job at your workplace and you receive money for that, you're more likely to keep doing a good job, right? That's reinforcing. So we want to encourage that behavior to continue, and we're adding something, right? We're adding money, we're giving you money. So that is positive reinforcement. And we can also do something called negative reinforcement. So here again, it's reinforcement. So we want to, again, encourage the behavior. But what we're going to do is we're going to take something away, but we're going to take something that you don't like away. So for example, how about chores? When you were growing up and you lived at home, you probably had chores you had to do. But a way to maybe reinforce you for doing something positive would be to say, you know what, you don't have to wash the dishes tonight. It's fine. I'll do it. Something that you typically don't like to do or don't like is removed. And that can be reinforcing. Right? So reinforcement can either be positive when something is added or negative when something that the organism doesn't like is removed. But the resulting outcome is that that behavior should occur more often. If we look at negative consequences, these are outcomes that are aversive or bad, and they are given to decrease the likelihood of a behavior occurring in the future. And we say that these are punishing. So these would be forms of punishment. So punishment can also be positive or it can be negative, very much like reinforcement, okay? The goal of punishment is always to decrease the likelihood of behavior. But the nature of the punishment, being either positive or negative, is either the addition of something that the organism wouldn't like or taking away something that the organism does like, right? So if we use something like positive punishment, we're adding something that the organism wouldn't like. So for example, if you are driving along the road and you're being that person because you're late and you're driving like 20 or 30 above the speed limit and you get pulled over and you get a speeding ticket, that speeding ticket is something that is added. So that's positive, but it's meant to decrease the likelihood of your speeding in the future. So that is punishment. positive punishment. Now, also we can do negative punishment. This is where we're taking away something that the organism likes. So, for example, being a teenager, if you remember, if you were able to drive and you either had your own car or you had a family car, you may lose privileges of having the keys to that car. So if you did something, you got in trouble, you might have your driving privileges taken away. So something that you like is being removed, right? Again, the goal is to decrease the likelihood of you doing whatever you did again. So it's punishment, but something is being removed that you like. So it's negative punishment. Let's take a look at reinforcement and punishment together, just so we can get an idea of the clear differences between them. Reinforcement is used when we want to increase behavior. Punishment is used when we want to decrease behavior. Positive and negative just refer to whether something is added or something is taken away. Here we look at the examples that I just gave you in the previous slides. So if we look at reinforcement first, reinforcement, remember, the goal of it is to increase the likelihood that that behavior will happen again. So these things, the giving of money or the removal of a negative chore that you don't like to do, both of these would be forms of reinforcement that would be more likely to get you to engage in the positive behavior again in the future. Next, we look at punishment. Remember, this is to decrease the likelihood of a behavior occurring. So here we have both examples of punishment that I gave: the giving of the speeding ticket and the removal of privileges. In my example would be car keys. So both of these things are forms of punishment. Something is being added or something is being removed, but the goal of both is to decrease the likelihood that that behavior would happen again. Now, if we look at positive, that is when something is added, right? That's all positive means. Something is being added. So in that case, the positive examples I gave you were positive reinforcement of money, but also positive punishment of paying that fine for a speeding ticket. Now, if we look at negative, that is when something is being removed. So a negative reinforcement, the example I gave you was that chore removal. You don't have to wash the dishes anymore. Now the negative punishment, that example was the removal of privileges. You don't get to drive, right? Your car keys get taken. The goal of both is actually different. Negative reinforcement is still meant to increase the likelihood that you'll engage in that behavior again. Negative punishment is to reduce the likelihood of you engaging in that behavior again. But the thing they have in common actually is that something is being taken away. So I would suggest taking a look at this chart here carefully to make sure that we understand the differences between reinforcement and punishment, but also the difference between positive versus negative. Now let's look at the different types of reinforcers. The first one we could consider is primary reinforcers. We like to say that these are things that are innately pleasing. That is, you don't have to be told to like these things. You don't have to be trained to like these things. You just do. So for example, things like food and water, you don't need to be told food is good. You don't need to learn that it's good. You don't need to learn that water is necessary. Warmth is good. Like you need a certain level of warmth to not freeze to death. These are things that are just innately pleasing. Right? You don't have to learn to like them. Now, obviously then, because you don't have to be trained to enjoy these things, they can be great things to use as reinforcers when we want to train a behavior. But the issue here is that a participant can what we call satiate. What that means is that you've had enough. You can only eat so much food. You can only drink so much water. You can only stand so much heat. So at some point, these things kind of lose a little bit of their value, at least in that moment. Right? So we can only use so much of them. Now, what that means when we're trying to train a behavior is that after a while, the subject is going to stop performing the behavior because they've had enough of the reinforcement. And that's kind of a tough thing if it's something that you need to train for a long period of time. You need them to continue to engage. But after a while, they don't want to because they've had enough of your reinforcer. So that's something to keep in mind. Remember, if you're like training your dog, for example, you keep giving them treats. You don't have to train them to like the treats. They're primary reinforcers. But the problem is, after a while, they get full and they don't want to engage in the behavior anymore for a while. So what you can do then is use what we call secondary reinforcers. Now these, we have to learn to like these. We have to learn, or through association, that these things are good. So they have to be paired with primary reinforcers to have any value. For example, money. Money has no value on its own. You have to learn that money is good. If you give money to a 1-year-old, they have no idea what it is and they don't care. You give money to a 20-year-old, they know very well what it is. you know that you can use that to buy primary reinforcers. You can use that money to buy food, to buy shelter, to pay for your bills. You can use that money for many things, but you had to learn that money was good. And the cool thing about secondary reinforcers is that while you have to learn that those things are good, they have to gain reinforcing value by being paired with primary reinforcers, which takes time. But once that happens, it's harder to satiate on secondary reinforcers. So for example, money. People usually don't get tired of getting money. You can keep giving money as a reinforcer and people will just keep performing that behavior. So something to keep in mind if you're trying to train an animal, for example. So your dog, if you want to train your dog, treats are good, but again, those are primary reinforcers. Your dog is going to get full after a while. But what you can do, and maybe many of you are familiar with it, is clicker train them. So click and then give the food treat. And after a very long time, that click can sometimes serve as a very reinforcing thing because it's been associated with food. So it's something to keep in mind if you want to train a behavior, is to use secondary reinforcers because it will allow the organism to engage in the behavior longer. Now, how do we use punishment? We know that punishment is used to discourage undesired behavior. Firstly, what you would want to do is clearly define what the undesired behavior is. A lot of times we're not very successful in using punishment because it's not exactly clear to the organism what you don't want them to do. So it's good to define very clearly for yourself and, if possible, your participant or your subject, what exactly is the undesired behavior. What do we not want to see happen again? But in addition to that, I think very important is to obviously be consistent, but also give an alternative behavior. So not just don't do that, but what can you do instead? For example, we can use a small child. A small child might get angry and throw a toy. That's obviously a behavior that's inappropriate and we don't want them to do that, but just telling them stop isn't very effective. We have to figure out not only how to get them to stop engaging in that exact behavior, but give them something to do instead. Show them an appropriate way to be angry. That could be in the form of deep breathing or using their words to describe how they feel, maybe separating themselves from the situation, basically giving them other behaviors that they can engage in that you would rather see, rather than just telling them not to do something. So punishment can be very effective. We just have to think about how we're using it. We have to clearly define the behavior we don't want to see. We have to be very consistent. Every time we see that behavior, we have to immediately cut it off. But then also give the subject other things that they can engage in, other positive behaviors that would be good for them to do instead of the behavior that you don't want. The last thing to consider for now for this presentation when considering using reinforcement and punishment is to consider individual differences. What is going to be reinforcing for a certain individual might be very different for another individual. For example, if we think about when we work with kids, a lot of times we might give them candy or something like that. But what if a kid doesn't like candy or that certain type of candy that you're using? For example, if you give a kid a lollipop, that kid may only like chocolate. Or if you give that kid something that has nuts in it and they don't like nuts, then your reinforcer that you think is going to increase their behavior, it isn't reinforcing because they don't like what you're giving them. The opposite is very true of punishment as well. We really need to consider what is going to be punishing of a certain behavior or to a certain individual. For example, again, if you're working with a child and you're yelling at them, you may think that you're punishing them because you're obviously, expressing that you don't like what they're doing. You're raising your voice. To you, that might be a great form of punishment. But we have to think about, why is that child engaged in that behavior? They might be wanting attention. And if they want attention, your yelling is still attention. So what you've actually done is reinforce what they just did, even though you think you're punishing it. So really think about why that behavior is occurring and what might be a good punisher. In this case, in the example that I just gave, the thing to do if the child is actually wanting attention, the best thing for you to do might actually be to ignore them and disengage completely. Then they're not getting what they want. Their behavior may actually increase for a minute. They may actually persist on that behavior a little bit longer, but if it's not getting them reinforcement, after a while they'll stop performing that behavior. And that might actually be the best punisher for that particular instance, is just to ignore it. So we want to think about multiple things, but the main thing here is individual differences. What may work well for you as a reinforcement may not work very well for me as a reinforcement. And the same is true for punishment as well. We really need to consider the individual when we're using both reinforcement and punishment procedures. So I hope this lecture helped you understand operant conditioning a bit more and the importance of understanding the differences between both reinforcement and punishment and the uses of positive and negative in the terms of how they relate to both reinforcement and punishment.